Alright, so I came across a topic yesterday that I thought that we should get in on, and it's a conversation from Fallen here, and he had some thoughts about the way that Shiro was handled in the UB-Dub anime. He says that Shiro got an adequate amount of characterization in the UB-Dub anime, and if you think that he didn't, while trying to justify that they cut out too much internal monologue from the VN, then you just weren't paying attention. Now, I'm not gonna laser focus on Shiro because I really want the point to revolve around the dialogue itself, but I am gonna throw Shiro in there. I remember when I first got into the fandom and I had first watched the remake of UB-Dub while it was airing. And in that time, I saw a ton of people saying, you know how the purists are, I saw a ton of people saying, oh, this is all wrong. Oh, this isn't good. There's so much context that's not here that people really need to see. And I was really taken aback by this because I'm watching the show and I'm like, this is great already. You're telling me that it's better? And this is before I got around to reading the VN. So I feel like there are certain parts where it's necessary that the dialogue has to be there, but you don't always have to have it. It really just depends. It's a circumstantial thing. Like, if I truly enjoy a character, I'm gonna want to spend more time with them anyway because I just find them more interesting. But if you're a show like Fate Zero, for instance, you have to do more of a format where you do a lot more showing instead of telling. And we just talked about that in the Wotame video. I brought up how Tsiah has very little screen time when you really sit down and think about it. And he's not the only one, because the way that FGO works, you got an entire chapter for most people, so you got to get off whatever point that you got to get across in that chapter, or the narrative is moot. But for the most part, people tend to stick to their opinions on that character unless they pull a Jason. Musashi is a great example. I've seen people say they love Shimosa. I've seen people say that they love the concept around it. Domen, Muramasa, but they cannot stand the idea of Musashi being shoved down their throats the entire chapter. Plenty of dialogue, plenty of internal monologues, but that doesn't make it better for everybody. That doesn't make it a non-negotiable. And even though I love Musashi, she's one of my favorite servants and figures in general, I feel like that's where you delve into a realm where it's too much dialogue and an unjustified amount of dialogue to top it off. Like, for a person to have an entire chapter revolve around them and for people to still dispute their character, something is wrong with that. Like, I'm seeing people say they couldn't wait for her to sacrifice herself in LB5. And that's why there needs to be a proper balance. And that's what I really liked about Fate Zero, is that there was a lot of balance. It was one of those shows where you didn't mind jumping from character to character because the overarching theme that weaved together was so compelling. It's like, where is this guy? I wonder what's happening with him. But at the same time, what's in front of my face is captivating enough for my mind not to wander off too much and call it a lack of characterization. Whereas you got people like Emiya Alter, who a lot of times just shows up out of nowhere when it matters the most, and then he disappears for the rest of the story. And a lot of people will come out the wetworks and say, well, that's the point. No, it's not. That's just bad characterization. So now it feels like there's a lack of backbone. Now it feels like he's less of a character and more of a thing to make the plot move along, and kind of just running off the name of Emiya, which is infinitely more insulting than having the audacity to call it good characterization. But going back to Fate Zero, that was a lot of characters for them to juggle in just 25 episodes. And I feel like they did an incredible job with that. And Fate Zero is no different from anything else. If you go to the source material, of course it's gonna be better. It's more context. There's a bunch of scenes in Fate Zero, if you read them, they're 10 times better. But it didn't take away from the point. You go over to Fate Stay Night, it's not the same thing, because everything is honed in on Shiro. So he has to carry the weight of the entire story on his shoulders. If you don't like Shiro, you're probably not gonna like majority of the story because you're just there for the surrounding characters and they don't get nearly as much focus. And you guys know I love Shiro also. I kicked off the channel doing his analysis, but there are just certain people that just don't like this man. It doesn't matter how many times you break down his character, how many times you try to dissect his thought process, that's just not their jam. And that's completely fine because I feel like his character is more of an acquired taste anyway. I didn't like Shiro at first either. When I first watched Shiro, there were a lot of times that he irritated the fuck out of me until I read the novel. And I was like, oh, okay, but it shouldn't have to be that way. And that's not every scene, but it's the most important scenes. And ultimately, he ended up becoming one of my favorite characters. So that alone just goes to show that there's a time and there's a place to insert all this dialogue or the internal monologues, whatever the case may be. If a person already doesn't like a character, it doesn't matter how much internal monologue you stuff in, they're just not gonna like them even more because you're giving them more focus. As far as my thoughts on the UB-dub anime, ultimately, I thought it was good. I still feel like the VN is superior, but it's not so bad to say that I wouldn't recommend it to somebody else. It's way better than that movie, I'll tell you that much. And that's the thing about these dudes, they'll complain about anything. You could get the show near perfect and they'll be like, well, it wasn't a 9.5, so it doesn't count. Well, I would have done it this way. Nobody cares what way you would have done it. It's not your story. How you got imposter syndrome over something that's not even yours? But they find a way. I like the VN, but I'm not one of those people that I'm looking down on an anime only that doesn't care for it. And honestly, if you really read the route, people always love to talk about what's missing. There's a lot of parts that's not necessary as well. Like there's a bunch of parts in the route where I feel like he's just beating a dead horse over and over again. And that's my favorite route. That's my favorite route, and I'm saying that. There's pockets where he makes a point and then he just keeps making the same point over and over again. It's like, okay, we get it. Survivor's Guild. It's like, okay, we get it. Trauma. It almost becomes condescending. But there's also incredible moments of internal monologue. His conversation with Kirei under the church and him finding out about the other orphans in the Fate route. The discourse in the internal monologue when he was going against Gil and leading up to that battle in UB-dub. I'll switch over to Heaven's Feel, for example. The Heaven's Feel movie was great, but the fight between him and Kirei could have been way better if it had the proper internal monologue and the dialogue. That was one of my favorite scenes in the entire novel. In the movie, it was mid. I accepted it for what it was because the rest of the movie did a pretty good job, but the fight was mid by comparison. I can't even compare the movie to the novel when it comes to that fight because there's just so much that they dive into and also conclude on in regards to their characters that wasn't present. And what you end up getting is a completely different scene and the two of them just beating on each other when it was supposed to be much more than that. It should have been just like Kirei's fight with Kirisugu and how precise that was because it was serving as the parallel. The directing could have been better, the choreography could have been better, the music, everything. For me, it's whatever gets the job done. You don't necessarily have to hit me with an onslaught of dialogue. But if you're not gonna do that and the character is interesting enough, you need to make sure that that's being properly expressed every time that they're on the screen. You know, it's funny, Kirei doesn't say all that much in the anime in comparison to his novel form. When you go to the church in the novel, you know that theme is about to play and you know that you're about to get hit with a sermon. He's gonna explain a ton of things and it's still an enjoyable experience. Never have I went to the church and I was like, oh, this dude again. Because every time that he's on the screen, he makes it count. Whereas sometimes you get people and they have dialogue and it just doesn't mean anything. And then you got some people that you can't wait for them to get off the screen. Like, please give me somebody that talks about something that actually matters. Please. And speaking of characters that make their showcases matter, Koyanskaya is another person that does the exact same thing. We're not with Koyanskaya and Doman for the entire chapter. Heian is the first chapter that we just sit with Doman, and that literally just came out not too long ago. They're characters that pop up here and there. And to me, they're still some of the most interesting characters because when they show up, they make it count. You can have all the monologue in the world. If you show up and you're not expressing yourself the way you're supposed to, or when you do finally express yourself, it's not something that merits any attention, the audience could care less. Yet every time I hear those three characters come up, it's usually great things about them. So for the people that think that there has to be this internal monologue, it doesn't have to be there. And I bet you I could find you a character that you enjoy that the internal monologue did not have to be present, but they were so impactful when they were on the screen that they didn't need it. Now, I love getting in on the opposite side of the spectrum if I find the character interesting. I love getting in a character's head and seeing their process. It just makes for a completely different story that way. But it's gotta be a good character. There's gotta be proper setup. Like, don't give me Sig. I see it all the time. People would have loved for Mordred to have been the main character of Apocrypha because they just got tired of seeing Sig. It's like, yeah, we get your point. We understand your point. The point sucks. And Mordred is just a far better and more enthusiastic character when she's on the screen. She actually gives me hope. She actually makes me want to keep watching. She has a great relationship with her master and it doesn't feel forced. And then on that other side of the spectrum, you got people like Prelati and Sigma and Strange Fate, who I've covered on the channel, who are excellent characters. When you really get into who they are and what they do, it doesn't really matter the why because the journey is so interesting. The process just makes you wonder, okay, what are they doing right now? You told me that he was gonna be a Lancer. That's a seed that was sown at the very beginning of his introduction. So the entire novel, you're just thinking throughout your head, okay, what is he doing to acquire that role? What steps is he taking to actualize him becoming a part of the Lancer class? And now you want that internal monologue. How does he feel about it? How does he feel about all these weird spirits and the Watcher over his shoulder for the entire story? And then you got things like Oath Under Snow Shiro. If you really pay attention, well, first of all, that comes from a manga and not a novel to begin with, so there wasn't that much dialogue either way. But even with that in mind, Oath Under Snow Shiro didn't need a lot of dialogue to be a great character. He showed, he proved, and he conquered. Even in the movie, even in the adaptation, nothing changed. In fact, some parts of the adaptation are better. But a lot of his processes come out as dialogue instead of internal monologue, and they're still able to get their point across really well.